Hello, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the Oxford Martin School. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Dale Whittington to talk to us today. Dale is professor in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's also a visiting professor in the School of Geography and the Environment here in Oxford, and a visiting fellow here in the Oxford Martin School. Dale, as many of you will know, is really one of the most distinguished and influential water economists in the world. His economics of water has covered a whole range of different domains, from the hydroeconomics of large river basins, like on the Nile, through to much more micro work around drinking water supplies, water supply and sanitation. And in a sense, today's talk, I think, is going to somehow bring those two things together, in that water supply is increasingly threatened by some of those large-scale macro effects going on in the environment, and overexploitation of water resources at large scales. And that, I think, is what brings us to the Anthropocene in the title here. So Dale, a great pleasure to have you with us. Dale's going to speak for as long as he wishes to speak for, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions from the room, and also questions from people who are joining us online. The lecture and discussion is being recorded, so just bear that in mind when you're asking your questions. But at that, I'll hand over to Dale.
Thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. I know Jeff Sachs is speaking at the same time, and just as luck would have it, this is not the first time in my life I've been back to back against Jeff Sachs. So thank you. I know the trade-off here was made me hard, so I appreciate you coming. It's a pleasure to be here. Jim said I could speak as long as I want. I'll talk about 45 minutes, no more than that. And it's so much fun to be back in the UK. I had a part-time position at the University of Manchester for 14 years, and it seemed like I was here all the time. And I hadn't been back since before the pandemic, so it's wonderful to be back home. I want to start and just mention that the Global Commission on the Economics of Water just released its final report on Thursday. And I encourage you to take a look. I had the privilege of supporting some of the work of the commission. My friend, the late John Briscoe, said in his Stockholm Water speech, John was the global water advisor at the World Bank. He said that water problems are local and their solutions are contingent. The Global Commission is kind of taking the opposite perspective and saying that water is actually a global common good. There's lots of interconnections, and we need to start thinking about it as a global resource. The Commission talks about a variety of problems that we're facing in the Anthropocene. The shifts in atmospheric rivers means we need a broader concept of the hydrological cycle than many of us have used in the past. We know about increased hydrological variation, extreme events, higher temperatures, loss of soil moisture, continental drying. There's lots of stuff going on. And decreases in water storage. And the Global Commission calls for the global community to reduce raw water withdrawals to stabilize the hydrological cycle. Now, most of that responsibility is going to fall on agriculture in one way or another. 70% of freshwater withdrawals are in agriculture. But I'm going to focus on cities and urban utilities in my talk today. And I think that the cities have a role to play, and there's other reasons in the Anthropocene besides the disruption of reducing the disruption of the hydrological cycle to reduce the water footprint of cities, reduce raw water withdrawals in cities. Now, in many cases, in water-scarce areas, cities are really going to be facing a complicated set of problems. I want to just emphasize at the beginning, I recognize that many cities are not in water-scarce areas. There's going to be plenty of cities that have plenty of water, but you know, more and more, we're going to see the threat of day zero all over the global south. So my lecture today has two parts. I'm going to try to summarize two different papers, and the methodology is quite different. In the first paper, I want to take a historical perspective on urban water and sanitation utilities and what their development path looks like, because the forces of the Anthropocene are going to be hitting them, these cities, and they're going to be at different stages of development. So we have a different set of problems depending on where the utilities lie on this development path. So I'm going to summarize some evidence on where utilities are today along this development path and why some utilities are stuck on this development path. In the second part of the talk, I want to use a very simple little systems model to look at the economics of a circular urban water system and think with you about what a policy mix for the Anthropocene, for some cities at least, would look like. And I want to focus on what is possible in terms of reducing raw water withdrawals in cities. And I think that's my punchline. I'll give it to you right now. If you want to, you can dramatically reduce raw water withdrawals from cities with technologies and policy mixes that we already have. So we'll talk about that. So first, I'm going to talk about the municipal water and sanitation development path. These are some my co-authors. I use this as these three phases as a simple description. Really, it's a continuum. There's no hard and fast a boundary between the phases. But I think it's helpful to sort of understand where utilities are globally. In phase one, investment is usually, not always, not in London, but usually it's dominated by the state because of the high capital requirements for urban infrastructure. The state takes responsibility for financing much of the urban infrastructure. Typically, not always, the rich households are connected first, and the poor are left unconnected with high coping costs. The REACH program here at Oxford, and Rob Hope, done a lot of work on looking at these coping costs and what does it really look like for households that aren't connected in terms of time collection, paying for vendors. But it's important to realize at this stage, many poor households can't be connected. There is no way to bring piped water into some of the housing units, right? So the city can't connect some poor households with piped water and sewer connection. Typically in phase one, the subsidies are very high, tariffs are very low, the leakage from the pipe systems are very high. In developing countries, non-revenue water 50%, not unusual. And at this stage, you don't see much investment in wastewater collection and treatment. The investment is really to get piped water to people. There are exceptions. In Nepal, you have sewer systems built without water systems, but usually you build water systems first, followed by wastewater collection, and then finally wastewater treatment. But this is not a stable system. There are four forces of disequilibria that push a city toward phase two. They're political, financial, technological, and public health. Political, poor households are paying high coping costs and they want private connections that they see the rich people enjoying, and there's political pressure to invest and connect. And the state needs financial resources to expand services, so there's pressure to increase tariffs. And technologically, we've characterized phase one as a sort of a low-level equilibrium trap. The low tariffs lead to high water use. There's no financial resources for maintenance, which leads to high leakage, which leads to rationing, which leads to unreliable service, and the poor and the middle class and the rich want better services than that. So technologically, this is not a stable system. And from a public health perspective, remember, phase one doesn't have wastewater treatment and collection, so there's public health risks and there's pressure from the public health community and the population for getting out of phase one and moving toward phase two. Now, in phase two, GDP increases economic growth, provides some resources for connection rates to increase. You see the beginnings of wastewater collection and treatment. And you see pressure to increase prices. Cost recovery does increase in phase two, but phase two is globally, it's been dominated by a debate on affordability. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. It's hard to raise prices in phase two. And there are forces of disequilibrium in phase two as well. As incomes grow, housing improves. So people don't want water outside their homes. They want to bring water in, which means they want private piped water and sewer services in their house. So housing really drives the demand for improved services in phase two. And environmental issues gradually increase in importance. If the wastewater is not collected or treated, there are environmental issues associated with it that as households get richer, they want these problems solved. So there are pressures to move beyond phase two, but there's also forces of stagnation. The most important probably is the political opposition to tariff increases from everybody. Everybody's used to low prices, the rich and the poor and the middle class. In phase two, the subsidies are going to the middle class and the rich. So they don't want prices to go up, and the poor still cannot really afford full cost recovery. So there's a pressures to try to figure out how to serve the poor and get the rich to pay more for services. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing that happens in phase two is that the public health risks decrease as a political issue. And that's not because the wastewater and sewer system has been solved, but it's because households have enough money to protect themselves in different ways, to buy bottled water and other things. I'm going to show you a graph that the people in the wash sector hate. I published this just this year with colleagues. And we asked about 7,000 people in 7 middle-income countries around the world a series of questions to ask them to rank their perceptions of the seriousness of health problems. So on this figure, the health problems span COVID to HIV to malaria to respiratory, TB. And on the far right is waterborne illness. And waterborne illness was the health issue of least concern in these 7 middle-income countries, except for South Africa, where it was second to last. So you see the political pressure on the public health side diminishes in phase two. I could talk more about this in the question and answer if anybody's interested. So let's get to phase three. Phase three, 100%, almost 100% of the city's population is connected to piped networks. You have 24/7 service, quality of water's pretty good. The challenge here is still serving the poor, and there's problems around the design of customer assistance programs and tariff structures. But many cities have reached this stage. But in the Anthropocene, it's not enough. We've got, even in phase 3, there needs to be new policy mixes to address these forces for what's coming. It's increasingly important to avoid day zeros. The Global Commission on the Economics of Water is calling for many cities to reduce their urban water footprint, reduce their wastewater discharges to the environment, and there needs to be investments to adapt to hydrological and climate extremes. So there's even work to be done in phase 3. So where are we now on this development path? It's surprisingly difficult, actually, to describe this with the global data that we've got, but I'm going to show you 4 graphs that give you some kind of picture of it. This first one is urban piped water coverage versus GDP per capita. And I've divided the 3 phases. The red is down in the lower left, coverage less than 50%. And you see most of these countries are under 10,000 GDP per capita. The yellow is what I'll characterize as roughly phase 2. And coverage increases, and then the green is roughly phase 3, where you get closer or at 100% coverage. You can see that for most countries, this breakpoint is around 10,000 GDP per capita. Past GDP per capita of $10,000, most countries are able to manage, getting almost everybody in the urban area connected with piped water. Let's look a little bit at sanitation. So these are sewer connections versus GDP. Similar kind of picture, but you can see that in phase 1, the red at the bottom left, these cities are not even started on that pathway. And the yellow is my phase 2, and it extends, beyond the 10,000 to about 20,000 GDP per capita. Just as a simple descriptor, over 20,000 US per capita, many countries have achieved almost, over 90% sewer connections. Wastewater treatment looks worse. Again, the red in the lower left, wastewater treatment hasn't even started, for many of these. The middle income countries, the yellow, go on out to 30,000. Above 30,000 GDP per capita, we start seeing most of the wastewater being treated, and that's mostly stage 3, phase 3. One more graph to kind of show you the description of the 3 phases. Again, this is average revenue per cubic meter of water sold. In the lower income countries, lower middle income, you're again way down on the lower left. The yellow triangles, upper middle income, you start to see some increases. Again, there's a lot of heterogeneity in this, but I think you see the pattern is you get a GDP per capita above 20,000. You start to see countries charging, $2 a cubic meter or more. Real cost recovery here, we'll talk about that, but it depends. Obviously, these costs are location specific, but $4 a cubic meter, $3 to $4 a cubic meter might be good numbers. Even in the high income countries, we're really not handling capital cost. So why is it so hard to make progress in phase 2? I think that my entire career, there's been a debate about water as a human right and water as an economic good. And there has been a compromise struck in terms of pricing, in terms of the design of water tariffs. And most countries now use increasing block tariffs, most countries in the global south, as somehow a compromise between this water as a merit good, as a human right, versus the objectives of cost recovery and economic good. And I've argued in many places that this is a bad compromise. And I just highlight the problem here by looking at the difference in two different increasing block tariff structures. Singapore, which is clearly in phase 3, uses an increasing block tariff, but for completely different reasons than countries in the global south. Singapore uses increasing block tariff to set a high price to communicate to people, don't use this much water. Above 40 cubic meters a month, that's too much water. If you use that, you're going to pay more. That is, if they do use it, they're going to recover Singapore's going to recover their cost, but they don't set a lifeline block. They set the lower block to recover their cost. They use the increasing block tariff to, think about it, providing information, to use water wisely. Don't use too much. And almost everybody in Singapore, over 90% of the population, their consumption falls in the first block. But look at the tariff structure used in Delhi. In Delhi, the first 20 cubic meters, if you use 20 cubic meters or less, you get it free, no water bill. So the majority of the population with pipe connections can fall in that. So they don't get a water bill. So there's no, at that level, it's, this is obviously going to cause financial problems for the water utility. If a utility uses above, a household uses above 20 cubic meters, an increasing block structure kicks in. They're charged for the first 20 cubic meters at a lifeline rate, and then gradually it goes up. But you compare it to the Singapore case, even at the top block, they're charging a fraction of the cost of providing those services. So that's a compromise, but it's a compromise that leaves, I will argue, Delhi really at risk of the forces of the Anthropocene. The utility is just grossly underfunded. The revenues are not there to provide secure services to one of the biggest megacities in the world. So that's the first part of my talk. And I want to move now to the second and look with you at sort of a circular water economy. What can cities do? And I'm going to ask two different questions with this simple model. The first one is, how much can cities reduce their raw water withdrawals? Just as an order of magnitude, just give us a sense of what's possible here in terms of reducing an urban water footprint. And the second is to look at the trade-offs between system-wide costs and raw water withdrawals. The first question turns out to be very easy to answer. The second question, surprisingly, turns out to be much harder than you might expect. So just think again about why we want to reduce raw water withdrawals. Obviously we don't want to reduce them to zero. We want people to have a sufficient water supply. But there are compelling reasons for not wasting water, or whatever we define waste. We can reduce negative externalities on the local water systems. The utilities are going to be in better shape to deal with extreme weather events and avoiding day zeros. If they're not, the more they have a closed system and are reusing water, the easier it's going to be to respond to extreme events. We're going to be able to reduce the financial cost of some components of the urban water system, so that's good. And the co-benefit that the Global Commission mentioned, I mentioned at the start, is to reduce the disruption on the hydrological cycle. So I'm going to show you some results from a really simple simulation model. We've done this as the constrained optimization model. The classic problem here that we're dealing with is to minimize cost subject to constraints on demand. The demand is satisfied. It's a classical planning problem in water resources management. So I'm going to use a baseline here. I'll pick a high-income city, 1 million individuals. I'm going to assume 250,000 households. Leakage at 30%. If we're in a developing country and leakage is 50%, the results will be even more dramatic. I'm going to start with total residential demand at 200 liters per capita per day and reduce that. In the United States, household water use in many places is several times that. So that's already high in terms of what's needed for a modern lifestyle, but can be much higher than that. So in a place like Phoenix, you could make dramatic reductions in raw water withdrawals, with the policy mixes I'm going to show you. I've got a non-residential demand component of 50,000 cubic meters per day. In the baseline, I have no potable reuse and no desalinization. So this is just a simple open loop system, flow through, inefficient, kind of similar to what we see in many places. I have nodes and links in this system, and what's different about this model than many sort of urban systems models is I'm going to try to attach cost to each node and link. I'm going to do that two different ways. I've got a simple cost function with fixed cost and variable cost, and then I've got a simple unit cost. If you think about the fixed cost and variable cost for a baseline system, I've got and that's kind of a short to medium term planning problem where the capital is fixed. If I reduce water usages, say here in Oxford, I don't reduce my capital expenditures very much. But in a growing city of the global south, if I can reduce my future demand, I will cut back on capital expenditures. So I'm looking here, what do I save financially by reducing raw water withdrawals and cutting back on consumption? I can also do this with unit cost, like dollars per cubic meter. And that is sort of a more long-run characterization of the system where I could sort of reduce my cost in the long run for small, medium-sized changes. I'm going to solve for quantities. I'm going to assume losses. And then I'm going to look at some interventions on this baseline system. I'm going to look at leakage reduction from 30% down to 10%. 10% is a number that many world-class utilities achieve. I'm going to look at demand reduction. I said I'm going to start with 200 liters per capita per day. I'm going to go down to 165 and then go down to 130. That's not aspirational in many places in Europe. It would be very aspirational in the United States and places in the global south. I'm going to put a potable water reuse facility in. So I'm going to do that in two stages. I'm going to look at recycling 30% of the wastewater for potable water reuse, and then I'll do 60. And then I'm going to add a desalinization, relatively small component for desal, and see what I can accomplish. So here's the circular water system with feedback. The green here are my policy interventions. So you can see here's the potable water reuse, here's the demand reduction, here's the leakage reduction, and here's the desal. I mean, a key point here is that now there's water going from the wastewater treatment plant back to the water intake. And as I said, this is going to be 30% of the wastewater and then 60% of the wastewater. This is a closed loop with feedback, and the key thing to realize, it takes a little bit to reach steady state on a system like this. I mean, because you use the water more than once, right? As you recycle, then that water also gets recycled, and you save water. So this is these are linear equations, but the system's non-linear. I'm going to show you results for 5 policy mixes. And the policy mixes are combining, the first one, policy mix 1, combines leakage reduction and demand reduction. Policy mix 2 has the same leakage reduction from 30 to 10%. Demand reduction goes all the way down to 130 liters per capita per day. Policy mix 3 is the same as 2, but adds the potable reuse. And policy mix 4, potable reuse, it should go to 60. It says 30 on the slide, but that should go to 60. And then policy mix 5, I do everything. I reduce leakage from 30 to 10. Again, I want to emphasize 30 is not so bad globally in terms of leakage. I mean, it could be 50. Demand reduction goes from 200 to 130, potable water reuse of 60, and desal at 50%. What do I, so we can talk about the cost here in the question and answer if you like. The only point of this slide I want to make is I've got costs on nodes and links here, and those are very hard to get. The best outcome for me of this talk, if somebody in the audience says, hey, I know those costs at nodes and links and different water systems, but it's very hard to get this information. And I have costs for the baseline system, that's above the green line, and I've assumed cost for the interventions below the line. So my system-wide cost calculation is going to include the cost at all the nodes and links in the network, plus the cost of the interventions that I've added. So let's look at the answer to the simple question first. What can we do in terms of raw water withdrawals? This package of of interventions, policy mix 5 is here on the right. I can reduce my raw water intakes by 75%. So for every cubic meter I took out before, I could take 250 liters after this intervention. That's a huge reduction. And it would be bigger than that, again, in much of the global south where leakage rates are high. So in terms of reducing an urban water footprint, we can do a whole lot with technologies that we've already got. I would point out that some of my policy interventions are kind of within the control of the utility. The leakage reduction, adding potable reuse, and desal. The reductions in consumer demand, water use, the utility can try to incentivize that with behavioral nudges and prices. And some places globally are pretty successful at that, others not. I mean, that's a political problem to try to get water use down to those levels. But if you succeed in getting water use down to 135 liters per capita per day, which is about what my wife and I use, it's not so hard. I mean, and I have a big house with a dishwasher and wash. I mean, this is a modern lifestyle. I mean, a lot of the reduction in household water use comes from just paying attention, fixing leaking toilets and taps being, I mean, this is, there are, I think, welfare losses associated in some cases with reducing water use down, but I don't think so much. I mean, it does take some money to fix leaks and leaking toilets, but this is not a drastic step. I mean, we could do this. Okay, now I want to look at system-wide costs now by policy mix. And The key point here that I would take away from this graph, this figure, I mean, given the accuracy of this little model, all of these things are about the same. In other words, the interventions cost you something, but they also save you some money. And within the accuracy of these calculations, these are all about equal. They're not, I mean, adding desal does cost more, and we know that desal is expensive, and I'm not arguing that desal will be a part of every policy mix. But from a systems point of view, it doesn't add that much. In my calculations, it adds 12% to system cost. Obviously, it depends on the size of the desal plant you put in and so forth. But so that's kind of an interesting, to me, kind of result that many of these interventions almost pay for themselves within the accuracy of these calculations. And if you look here at this trade-off that I talked about to start with between raw water withdrawals on the vertical axis so this is my baseline, and this is system-wide cost. And as I reduce raw water withdrawal, system-wide cost increase along here, but not too much. I mean, this is a Pareto improvement, actually, in policy mix 2, just doing the leakage reduction in the networks and demand reduction actually reduces costs compared to the baseline and dramatically reduces raw water withdrawals. So let me just wrap up. I'm right on time. So what kind of policy mix is feasible for the Anthropocene? Reducing leakage is at the top of the list. Higher tariffs and behavioral nudges to reduce customer water use. Reuse of wastewater for potable reuse in some cases is going to make sense. Desal, some places, is going to make sense. We, for sure, need customer assistance programs to make sure that the poor can afford these higher prices of water. Some places, nature-based solutions are going to be more effective than, secondary, tertiary wastewater treatment. Singapore's already gone a long way toward this. But I want to conclude, I made it sound easy. It's not. And why isn't this easy? The political economy of this is really tough. Those system costs I showed you they included capital cost, both depreciation and opportunity cost of capital. Most systems around the world, you don't pay for depreciation. That's why we see the pipes in the ground depreciating as much as they do. So people, if they had to pay for depreciation and the opportunity cost of capital of these very capital-intensive networks, they would see, higher water bills. I was actually just coming to Oxford yesterday. I walked down the street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the utility crew was digging up the water pipes, and everybody else was walking by real quickly, and I spent a little time looking at, what was underground. I mean, the pipes have probably been there for 100 years. They're really gone. I mean, they're fully depreciated. I mean, it's very expensive to repair. So to fix these leaks and really move toward an up-to-date system, we've got a lot of backlog of capital expense here. That's, we're going to have to deal with that one way or another anyway, and it's not really fair to lump it onto the problem of dealing with the forces of the Anthropocene, but that's the reality that we're facing. The forces of the Anthropocene are coming at us. At the same time, we've got this big backlog of depreciated capital stock in many parts of the world. But the other thing about the political economy of this problem that I'll point out is that I've said tariffs have to go up. System-wide costs don't go up that much if you take account of the full capital cost. But from the household's point of view, they don't go down, and the amount of water that households are getting is going down. So it looks like they're getting a deal where they get less water for the same or a little bit more money, and they have to pay for the depreciated capital stock. It's a hard thing to sell. It's easier to sort of kick the can down the road and say, well, you know, maybe next year we'll start rehabilitating this capital stock. But on the other hand, I mean, the Global Commission on the Economics of Water is telling us, you know, don't wait. You know, the hydrological cycle is disrupted, and you're going to have a lot more problems coming at you. You better start focusing on them now. Thank you very much. I don't usually do that. That's right.
There we are. That's great.
Is it 40
Thanks
minutes?
a lot. Yeah, we've got about minutes or so. Let me get this right. For questions, both here in the room, and I think Clara's going to tell us if things come in online. Please just raise your hand and introduce yourself if you have any questions. Just hang on for the microphone.
Hello, I'm Ranjan Ramasamy. I'm primarily from a biochemical and immunological background, but I do have an interest in global sustainable development. One comment, two comments, very brief comments. One is Anthropocene, that's not really been accepted by the geologists. Would you like to comment on that? Is that correct? The term Anthropocene, although it's absolutely correct in terms of what impact humans are having. Can you hear me?
I can. It's a great question, and I'm not an expert, so I'm using the term perhaps loosely. Jim would be in a much better position to define the Anthropocene than I am, but I mean, to me, it's a good starting point is from a socio-technical perspective is when Roger Revelle sort of looked at trends in CO2 and found that they're historically we're in a different era. The Global Commission is looking at a variety of indicators, and it's hard to sort out exactly what is man-made and what's not. I mean, that's not an area that I work in, but the people at the Global Commission that are the experts on this are convinced that we have a different set of problems. Maybe you don't want to call it the Anthropocene. You have a better term for it, but I don't know. Jim, do you?
Yeah. Of course, these topics are always contested, but and the notion of the Anthropocene is looking across a whole series of indicators across the Earth system. So Dale mentioned carbon emissions, but also if you look at nutrient cycling, nitrogen, phosphorus, for example, one looks at soil erosion, you look at land use and biodiversity loss. In all of those great cycles, we're seeing a significant human footprint, which is off the rail, and that's usually associated with the so-called great acceleration in the post-war period of massive industrialization around the world. So, yeah, we're going to keep on arguing about this, but to be honest, I don't think the definitional question is the thing we should be too bothered about. It's what we do about it.
I would say, you know, take a look at the report of the Global Commission. You can Google it, or I'll put a link in my slides. I mean, one of the most provocative things in the report is the shifts in the atmospheric rivers. This is the work of Johan Rockström and his team. And it's really quite provocative. I mean, to see the you know, the model simulations where, you know, exactly what's going on. And this is a new world in the hydrological cycle that we're sort of trying to wrap our heads around. See what you think. I mean, you know.
And you had another question?
Well, another comment actually, and that is Singapore, as far as I know, I mean, the water supply management system is government run, and they have a very strong, good work ethic. Around this area, we've had a lot of problems that have surfaced recently, and that is because the company is private and the oversight has been very bad, to say the least. I mean, I think that's the general opinion. So I think, would you like to comment on that? I mean, this is a societal problem rather than actually an economic water management problem.
Well, I guess you're raising the issue, do we need public ownership of water utilities in the Anthropocene? And the way I interpret the evidence is either can work and either can fail. You know, I think you had, my own view is you had some bad luck with Thames and Off-White oversight, but if I think globally, I think Off-White's, you know, a world-class regulator, you know, but nothing's perfect, you know. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm a student over at the business school, so constantly interested in how industry and commercial players come into water and water management. So do you think that the impetus for change primarily resides with the households, or what factor do you think commercial and industry should play in responding to policy changes and things like that? Because I think from the business perspective, there's a lot of change in power in industry as opposed to the household.
Yeah. So I agree with you that industry has a big role to play here, both on the technological innovation side and in terms of, in particular locations, reducing raw water withdrawals. But if you look globally, the big issue here is not industry, it's agriculture. It's not residential or industries, it's agriculture. And I focused on cities today. Actually, the Global Commission spent quite a bit of time looking at industrial innovation, and there's I mean, again, I'd encourage you to look at the report. There's lots of suggestions on things industry should do in terms of playing its part in solving this problem. I didn't mean to minimize the role of industry in this, but and in particular places, I mean, industry can you know can be a huge stakeholder and have a big impact on the water footprint. But globally, it's agriculture that we really have to think about. Yep.
I've got a background not in water. I'm not an expert, but it does strike me that the discussion about Anthropocene may be quite useful in the context of a political economy here in the UK that is very stuck, where the politicians suits them fine to blame Thames Water and the private companies who did rip off the system, but partly because the government, from what I gather, gave them permission to and allowed them to. And now we're stuck, that people don't want to pay anymore because why should we pay those greedy sods? And so the Anthropocene might be quite useful for that. But I don't know if other places are as stuck. But to try and persuade consumers to pay more for water when they feel they're being ripped off is a difficult political economy situation to be in. And I'm not sure whether that's the same in the US and other places. But here in the UK, it feels very stuck in terms of the political economy.
Well, that's what I tried to say about many utilities in the global south. The policy discussion is stuck on this, and it's been stuck for decades, my whole career, on, you know, should water be free, or, you know, should people be paying the cost? And this is a difficult discussion. There's actually a lot in the Commission report about this debate. But I think that this is going to become an increasingly costly, unproductive debate in the Anthropocene. I mean, we're if we just keep having this discussion without making any progress in terms of modernizing water utilities, making them more resilient, recycling more water, we're going to get, it's going to seem increasingly sort of off track. I'm from North Carolina, and we've just had a hurricane go through western part of the state near Asheville, and it's been catastrophic, and it's an area where a lot of people from Florida have actually been going to get away from hurricanes, right? I mean, you kind of, people would say, oh, it's too risky to be in Florida anymore. Let's go to the mountains of North Carolina, you know, and then they're devastated by these heavy rains. These are events that, I'm not saying that particular event is driven by climate change, but we've never seen anything like this. I mean, you know, so these are catastrophic rains far from the coast. You know, the infrastructure's been wiped out in many, many cities. I mean, it's going to take a huge investment to recover from this.
If I may just follow up on that one in relation to the sequencing of reform and willingness to pay, which is something you've worked on. I mean, the implication here is that, okay, we recognize that maybe we all need to pay a bit more and use a bit less, but there's a level of frustration in many parts of the world in terms of the services which people have been provided with. So, I mean, what would your advice be around breaking that cycle?
I think it depends on the local context and local politics. It's hard to generalize, but I do think that customer assistance programs really need to have a lot more attention. I mean, everybody wants, in phase 3, all households to have piped water connections and not have their water cut off. I mean, you know, so how can that happen? Well, most people can't afford to pay their water bills. They have to get used to paying higher water bills, but they can afford to pay higher water bills. I mean, you know, this is a very valuable service. I mean, it's, you know, cities don't function without, you know, right? So, but we do want poor households to have it, and there are a variety of programs around the world that target poor households to make sure that they can pay their water bills. The problem that people, I think, don't really internalize is that if you make water free, too much water gets wasted, and that's a real big problem in the Anthropocene, right? I mean, and so it's always a problem. It's just going to become an increasing problem. If you don't price water at all, you'll have very high water use rates, water use estimates. But customer assistance programs are workable. Singapore has them increasingly in the United States. People are, when I first started my career, Chile had one of the best customer assistance programs. And then, so I would talk about this program as, you know, in different parts of the global south, and people would say, oh, yeah, but we couldn't do that. It's administratively too hard to identify poor households, keep those records up to date, and whatever mechanism you use to make sure that they can afford water. Well, there's two things about that argument is, well, nobody ever promised us it was going to be easy to make sure poor households had water. I mean, you have to invest in the institutions to make that happen. The second thing is it's gotten a lot cheaper. In the electronic age, I mean, a lot of information on who poor households are online. The banks all know. The banks could run this. Financial institutions could run customer assistance programs, no problem at all. They know how rich every, you know, sort of balance sheets of every household it looks like, right? And so I think it's easier today. It just takes a political will to do it.
Okay, thanks.
I just have one thing to offer on that. I think what a lot of the people in this country are really annoyed about is because they're all privately owned, we're paying for the shareholders to get money. So the water companies are making £5 billion a year to pay their shareholders, but they still want to charge us more to put some new pipes in the water. Surely they should use that £5 billion to fix their infrastructure before charging us more money.
Is that a question?
Do you model for that? Is that in your economic modelling, shareholder costs?
Yeah. So I presume you're right that some of that money should have been spent on infrastructure rehabilitation. I would say that this issue of the opportunity cost of capital is a bit of a puzzle in the political economy of water supply, because people say, well, you know, if it's publicly owned, you don't have to pay shareholders, right? So, you know, the water can be cheaper because they don't get any dividends. But actually, from a full cost recovery perspective, I want the opportunity cost of capital to be embedded in the water. I want this signal going out to people to be that this is, you know, this is an expensive service. If you use more, I'm going to have, as a utility, I'm going to have to expand services, and that's going to incur capital cost. So when it's publicly owned, you just incur those capital costs in terms of your taxes. I mean, they're not gone; they're just not reflected in your water bill. I mean, but somebody pays those. Somebody pays the cost of capital. There's the depreciation of the stock, and we don't pay that now in most places. We just let the stock depreciate, and the opportunity cost of the capital. Think of it as borrowed money. I mean, if you have to borrow the money to invest, I mean, you have to make those interest payments.
Yeah. Question at the back here.
Oh, yeah. So I thought that the graph you had between Singapore and Delhi was very interesting with the tariffs. And I just wanted to ask for a comment on the capital incentives of like utility companies to kind of push people to use more water so that there is more higher costs coming in, and then the incentives for households to use as much water as they can essentially without having to pay those higher costs. I feel like that's a different sort of incentive that complicates the political economy here. If you have any comments about that.
Yeah. There's a really important point you made that I probably didn't emphasize. It's a good one. In sort of the story that I told about reducing raw water withdrawals, reducing consumption, the capital cost in my baseline case stay essentially the same. I mean, those are fixed costs. I've already invested in that. And if I reduce water use, there's going to be revenue shortfalls for the utilities. So they're going to have to figure out how to recoup that. Now, you're talking about the details of how utilities and customers behave with that increasing block tariff structure. That's a very good question. It's an area of active research. The way I interpret that, much of the research is customers don't even understand these tariff structures. They don't know how much water they use. They don't know how their bill is calculated. They don't know. So economists love to speculate, you know, about all the different things that people are doing at the margin to try to keep themselves, you know, below one of those block structures and stuff. I'm kind of skeptical. I mean, I'm sure some people or a few people are behaving the way you are describing on the customer side. But my guess is most people are too busy to pay much attention to these, especially in a place like Delhi where the prices are so cheap. I mean, you get 20 cubic meters for free. You don't get a water bill at all, you know, if you stay under 20. Just think, how do you run a water utility if you're giving away 20 cubic meters a month for free? You know, I mean, how do you address the problems of the Anthropocene in that world?
Okay, we're nearly out of time, but let's just have one more question.
Okay, thank you. Abu Bakr Muhammad. I work on water issues mostly in Pakistan in the Indus Basin, so where there are lots of phase 1 and phase 2 cities like Lahore and Karachi. So I was just wondering that the policy mix that you showed, how would you communicate that to the mayor of Karachi? A city where there are, of course, leakages, but even at the head of the pipeline, there is a whole tanker mafia which is stealing water at the head of the pipeline and then distributing within the city at exorbitant prices. So, I mean, just taking cue from your interaction with John Briscoe, who used to call this principled pragmatism. So what kind of principled pragmatism can you talk to the mayor of Karachi in the sense of I mean, the prices that you have computed for the leakage fixes, My point is that they wouldn't directly apply to these kind of situations. So these political economy kind of questions, how do you factor in?
Yeah. That's a great question. That's the kind of question I usually ask my PhD students. I don't usually get it asked myself. So no, I mean, you know, going back to John Briscoe's, you know, point, water problems are local. I mean, you know, I don't have a solution, you know, for the political economy of Karachi and the water vendor mafia. That's a big time political problem for the people of Pakistan. But if I did have an opportunity to speak to government leadership in Pakistan, I would emphasize that the risk of doing nothing are getting higher and higher. I mean, you know, this is a problem that, you know, I've been aware of in my career for 30 years. The water vendor monopoly in Karachi hasn't been solved. You know, people that have tried to address it have been murdered, as you well know. And there have been global documentaries on this. But it will get harder and harder to leave this status quo in place. I guess that's the message. And it is technically possible. I mean, and I guess that's the message from my policy mix story, to make dramatic changes in raw water withdrawals. Now, do you have the political will for that? You know, I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine in Italy about this, and he said, well, you know, the same thing in Milan. You know, we got 40% leakage, but the utility doesn't do anything because it's too expensive to fix the leaks. Well, it's, you know, okay, well, it's too expensive now. You know, when are you going to do it? You know, you're going to let leakage go to 50, 60, 70? I mean, at what point are you going to start, you know, having to address this issue of depreciated capital stock and solving this problem? And I'm saying the forces of the Anthropocene are just making this worse. We're already seeing systems in Italy where you know, that used to provide 24/7 service. It can't do it now.
That's a really important note to end on. What I'm hearing here is going to get harder and harder, but possibly a positive twist there in the sense that because it's getting harder, we've got to think again about some of these chronic syndromes which have been going on for decades. So with that, let me thank you all for coming and joining the discussion, and thank you, Dale, for a great talk.